He looked at his P&L, and as we reviewed it, hay expenses were too high, labor were too high. So he just draw lines through them and said, okay, let's just cut those things out.
That's Race King with the Matador Ranch. My guest today as we discuss this. What happens when you stop growing crops under pivots and start grazing livestock instead? With over 20 years of doing this, Race will talk us through what led to the change, what the results have been, does it pencil, even in poor markets, and whether this could work in other parts of the country. Then we'll pivot, and I pose this question. What if fly control didn't depend on mineral intake or ear tags? We take a look at a bolus-based approach with up to 195 days of fly control. That's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Today, it's kind of part two of our last episode here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi, everyone. Justin Mills here, your host. Good to have you with us on our program today. It was a couple weeks ago where we were talking with Troy Hadrick out of South Dakota about his process of moving away from growing crops or hay ground and those kinds of things on his dryland farm. Today, we're going to switch the horse a little bit here and talk with Race King, as you heard there in the opening, about how they have been grazing cattle under pivots. A great conversation. You're going to learn a lot, so stick with us. Also, of course, as you heard there, a new method of delivering fly control via a bolus, so we'll learn about that. And, of course, meteorologist Don Day will be in later on to talk about our weather. It's important. A lot of folks are really needing some moisture across the country. We'll find out what he has to say about that. By the way, the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine is out. It is the April-May edition, and if you don't have a subscription, you can start today by going to workingranchmag.com, or you can stop by your local Tractor Supply store. And a shout out to the Tractor Supply store in Walterboro, South Carolina, the one in Warsaw, Indiana, the Tractor Supply store in Weston, West Virginia, and in Wichita Falls, Texas. Just real quick, if you missed something here today, you have to step away from the pickup or the radio, however that might be. You can find all of our shows by going to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or if you have a preferred podcast provider, you can find it there as well. By the way, leave a ratings or a review. We will appreciate that. Well, let's turn towards our subject at hand here today. And joining us on the program is Race King, who manages the Selkirk division for the Matador Ranch in Montana. And Race, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
My pleasure.
You and I had talked before we started here. Our topic today is originating from a listener that had just put an inquiry out there as far as looking at ways that they could maybe potentially transition away from those that are in irrigation, whether it's pivot or other types of irrigation, and moving away from maybe crop and row irrigation growing to grazing feed or grazing cattle under that with feed. So I reached out to you because I know you have had extensive experience in this. And so I guess to get started with going back to your history and, what led to that transition that you began looking at this over 20 years ago.
Yeah. So in about 2003, we started seriously, implementing and learning about grazing cattle under pivots with irrigated pasture mixes. And it started a little bit before that, as to why. And really, I guess if we step back, previous ownership had bought the ranch, obviously really good business person, had really bought the ranch to run an equine program that he was quite passionate about. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the main step. Now, he had 88,000 acres of property here with the cattle operation, probably the first cattle he'd ever owned in his life, of any scale for sure. And really ran that business kind of status quo for a couple of years, but was really dissatisfied with the returns of running the base core of the ranch. Like a lot of us, we might have our personal interests, and he had his, of course, which were the equine program. And he was okay to subsidize that out of his pocket a little bit, but, he's kind of hoping that the rest of this ag venture paid those bills and, gave him some dividends, right? Mm-hmm. And really with the current climate of kind of doing what everybody was doing at the time, calving in March and April and selling 600-pound calves in the fall, or weaning a 600-pound calf, selling it, wintering those cows over on 4 or 5 months of hay, wasn't paying the bills, right?
Sure.
And so, When we started, really the desire to do this kind of started more from just trying to reduce overall costs. It's interesting, it was like the second thing we really started looking at. The first one was just looking at our cow-calf operation heavily and doing an enterprise analysis, which is like popular to say, right? Let's get rid of some equipment and try to graze, as much of the year as we could. Those were really what we started with. Obviously he was motivated and a businessman. I tell people, he looked at his P&L and as we reviewed it, hay expenses were too high, labor were too high. So he just draw lines through them and said, okay, let's just cut those things out. It wasn't reduce them.
Yeah.
Now, obviously through visiting, we come up with some things. And once again, I was new here. I was hired to help him implement some change. And so I was motivated. I needed a job, right? So, I wanted to succeed in some way. And he also, as maybe as firm as it might sound and naive to make some of those simple decisions, he did provide the support necessary as we started to look at changing, and obviously accountability was important to do the changes, but he gave that support and knew that, hey, if we have a wreck, I'm willing to support that, right? As we learn. And so we really worked hard, packed our calving dates up to more of a summer calving deal with our cow herd. Pretty cliche to say nowadays.
Yeah.
And sold a big line of hay and equipment and started to kind of look at ways to do things. And obviously, as we started wintering cows, a few less cows than we had initially, but grazing them essentially 12 months out of the year, we started looking at our irrigated land again and saying, boy, making hay and selling hay, because we didn't necessarily need it for the cow-calf operation anymore, really wasn't doing us that well. Once again, we're totally different than Nebraska. I know you mentioned a user out there. We can't grow corn here yet, and we sure did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Our low elevation spot here at headquarters is around 5,300 feet. And so a little different climate. So we could sure, as we ran, analysis on the enterprises, we could sure look at what hay production looked like and maybe what the small grain, so malt barley and things like that looked like. And so that's what we had to compare as we did our due diligence on the operation. Another twist as we did that initially, he also wanted to start developing a direct to consumer business. This is in the early 2000s. So once again, that was pretty forward thinking at the time. And we had a lot to learn there. So we started, to try to use maybe this irrigated pasture as a way to put some pounds on some cattle and do some grass finishing and other things and just try to hone in our skills. And so that's the motivation behind it.
Yeah.
Why we were doing it. Similar landscape to what farmers would be dealing with today, and that, hey, cropping, in our case, just simplistic, we could buy hay for about the same price as our cost of production.
Yeah.
So, why don't we look at some other uses for it, right? Another challenge, within our area, not only was hay close to that price, but there's no pasture available. If you wanted to go lease pasture, really high prices, and virtually, you better know a lot of people and have a really good reputation to be able to lock in anything, in the area, right? And, the little bit of grass that does come up for even summer grazing, it's gobbled up pretty quick. And yet there's always a haystack to buy, right? It's always a haystack. And so we just kind of had to look at it, the opportunity there as another concept, or at least context for us to kind of develop our program around.
Yeah. So in that race, and you really did a good job of kind of explaining there was a lot to that. It was really a business analysis. And like you said, it was a very business savvy gentleman that was, that owned the ranch. And I can't help but think it was his look at that, just because he wasn't raised in it and was looking at that in a very non-traditional aspect.
Yeah, I think you've hit it. As I described it to people, that might visit the ranch and ask that same question, I think a lot of us, especially family operations, and I grew up on a smaller family operation, it's pretty hard to change culture and history, right? As a manager, we get kind of in our rut with what's worked and what we like to do and perception, maybe what the neighbors think. And, it's kind of hard, but he looked at it entirely different. And he asked those, I use the word naive, right? Questions like make the statement, well, hey, labor's too high, let's cut some labor. Hey, if hay's too high, let's just don't buy the hay. and now obviously as the manager, we had to figure ways to cut the hay usage. And so I kind of say it this way, when you're hiring somebody to calve your first calf heifers, you probably don't want the most inexperienced guy to kind of take on some challenges, right? Or maybe to keep your weaned calf crop healthy for a while, right? Going through that 45 to 90 day period with them and getting them really straight. But at the same time, maybe when we're looking at, analyzing our businesses, having that perspective where maybe I was a little naive or inexperienced in ranching, but yet really strong backgrounds in business and really understanding a balance sheet kind of changed the conversation, right? So blending that with some of the guys we had on the ground, okay, that's a challenge. How are we going to do that? And, not have a bunch of dead cattle that starve to death in the winter, right? Because we don't put up any hay. And so I think it was an interesting relationship. And I think the reason it worked was because he provided the support necessary to say, okay, hey, as we implement these things, if something changes or we see something terrible, we can deviate. But here's our goal. And within the context of trying to be a lower cost producer initially, that's why we start making the changes.
Yeah. All right, Race, let's take a break here. And when we come back, let's start getting into the details of how you guys then actually made that transition. And actually, you provided a good segue to that as far as, the steps that we can look at that. So let's do that when we come back, all right?
You bet.
Imagine keeping your cattle exactly where you want them, while being able to tap into insights powered by a collar and an app. No Fence is the world's first virtual fencing system for grazing livestock. From the palm of your hand and delivered with GPS technology, you can set and move pasture boundaries, gain insight into grazing patterns, receive reduced animal activity alerts, and more. No wires, no posts, just empowered grazing that supports healthier land and your herd goals. 10,000 plus producers globally already trust No Fence. Explore the possibilities at nofence.com.
All right, Race. Now let's start getting into the steps that you began to take in this. Let's put some meat on the bone in this in the terms of the steps that you guys took.
So, at least at that time, we had about 3,500 irrigated acres, probably 85% of that under pivots. The rest kind of in a blend of, some hand lines and some well lines, but pretty much all sprinkler irrigated. And so we started to decide how to move forward. Obviously, he provided us with the opportunity to kind of try to go educate ourselves a little bit. And I had a little previous experience doing it, running cows like on a pivot and bouncing from one pivot to another and not really doing too much rotation, just maybe on one pivot for 3 to 4 weeks and then hit another one, right?
Yeah.
And definitely seen where, learned the challenges with that, right? And knew that to do that, we had to kind of get better with our skill set. So we started looking into the really more intensive grazing strategies. And, like a lot of folks, we hit the road and went and looked at a few people and talked to a few of the experts, if you will, at the time that were doing that in other places. And some of it just on wetter ground in the Midwest or the Southeast that were doing a little more intensive grazing. And so we kind of settled on some ideas that, we largely either got from a couple of consultants that we visited or from producers that we've seen some things that they were doing that we thought we could maybe bring back and get some employee buy-in on it and make it go. So largely we started with a couple pivots, and these were pivots that were in kind of some older, grass alfalfa type mixes, which, in our area, that's pretty typical for guys that are even raising hay. They might have some orchard grass and a little brome mixed in with alfalfa. And then over time, as the alfalfa gets a little weaker, then they start thinking of, maybe doing something else with it. And in our case, we had a couple of those pivots that kind of fit that bill. And so we went ahead and devised a fencing program that we really use today. Our first attempt at this wasn't too far off. We probably built a little nicer fence to begin with than we do now when we rebuild something.
Okay.
We found ways to cheapen it up a little for us, but we literally kind of did the Jim Garris type model. We took a lot of his maps and literally kind of put a 140 or 130, 40 acre pivot, put one wire around the outside perimeter of it, a high tensile, and came in and split it up in the middle with one more. So 2 one-wire electric fences, and then planned on using poly wire between those, portable wire, to kind of accommodate the rest. And so that largely is still what we do today. We've tweaked it a little bit, like you said, on how we do it. In our case, you can take one pivot and run some black poly pipe, lay on the ground under that inner ring, and that becomes our stock water, right? We can use portable water tanks to bounce off that, but that's literally what we did to begin with. We've changed our portable tanks a little bit. We started off thinking, well, we'll move cattle weekly, do a little bit better job. And then it got to be, all right, we're looking at them. It looks like this really isn't taking, as we started getting more comfortable with rolling up poly wire, doing some things like that, we started to really hone our skill in. And ultimately we got to where we do daily moves on the livestock. And that expanded from one of our pivots to all of our pivots.
Okay.
So today we literally, even if we plant, we still will do a little bit of farming, but we do plant annuals and things like that in there when we're trying to refurbish a pivot, but we still set them up and plan on grazing them as much as possible.
Ray, you said that for the most part, what you're doing now from a fencing standpoint is fairly similar to what you're doing. What you did then is what you're doing now. And so with your infrastructure, what would be some major things you would pass on to folks about that infrastructure development?
So for me, and if I was going to say, how to make that work is, number one, keep it pretty simple.
Okay.
Right? So that you can have some flexibility, but maybe, I think more of it's somewhat philosophical a little bit, the things that are the most important. Really the how, if you have an employee that likes to roll wire a certain way or use this product, that's just more about the employee or maybe the family member. But I think if you really start realizing that the important thing is try to make that one pivot become 30 pastures.
Okay.
Right. And I think if you really start looking at it, how do we do that? I noticed you've had Ranching for Profit and some other, speakers on. Back when I went to them, they started looking at, hey, you're not really managing your resource right till you start getting into 15 to 20 pastures, right? Yeah. Well, we look at one pasture and say, hey, how do we make this last 30 days for that group of cattle so that by the time we're regrazing, it's had that much rest and is ready to be grazed again. And once we start honing that in, really, and then start building our system around that, then you can start figuring out how much water you really need and how much, all of these other little things that you need to kind of address as you move forward. But for us, that was pretty key. And I'm not saying you have to graze or rotate pasture every day, but for us, that became one of our employees thing. Hey, by the time I go look at their livestock water and check their mineral and make sure there's a little bit of health, I've already kind of disrupted their grazing.
Yeah.
And for us, like, and it's summertime, right? And gosh, it only takes me like 15 minutes to leapfrog a poly wire and move a water tank. Why don't we just move them every day? Why are we only doing it every 3 and 4 days? And I think the cattle will be more content, right? And, and once again, having that employee buy-in and people all the way through. You can't develop a scenario that so only works on paper. And I think, everything's good to a point that I've learned, but, our people and their quality of life is super important to us as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a lot of different systems, but I would say I had a friend that I looked up to a lot, a really good rancher. We've all got those guys that, that have meant a lot to us in our lives, especially when we were younger men and trying, and somebody that helped me out. And after we'd been doing this for 4 or 5 years, he showed up and was coming through and he goes, this thing, it must not be working very good, huh? And I go, well, why do you say that? And he goes, well, you're still using portable fencing. It's not really work. Why would you still be using portable fencing? Why wouldn't you have those pastures, set up permanent? And I think being able to verbalize that and understand why we weren't, and I don't know if I really knew it yet, but what the story of being able to answer that correctly really tells a lot what's important to it. So number one, let's take any group of cattle we put out on a pasture. They've got a certain nutritional need, right? They need so many pounds of dry matter to be happy. And I'll just ask you the question because that's kind of how I do it with a group of people here. Do you think they're going to need more pasture per day or more pounds of dry matter in a week, that group of cattle, or is it going to stay the same throughout the whole summer? Does their nutrition needs, do that go up or does it stay the same also?
Well, if they're growing cattle, that probably will go up, depending, class of cattle, but most of them probably goes up.
Exactly. And so it does. And I will say, yeah, it goes up, and it goes up quite dramatically. Just as those of you that are feeding cattle in a bunk, you're bunk feeding, right? And you've got cattle started on pasture or feed. It's the same way, same environment, really. You've got to be looking at how much feed they need for today. And obviously, if the bunk is slick, it's really easy to call for more feed and gradually, increase that. And for us, it's the same way, especially as you start dialing it down into those daily moves where you can really look at it. Hey, I overgrazed a little bit. That means I need to make that paddock just a little bit bigger for tomorrow. And so I can make sure I have adequate residual. Or maybe, as I'm starting out the season or getting into new pasture, maybe I got to adjust my eye back the other way. But that's super important. And I think the flexibility of having this portable fencing as part of that allows you to make those adjustments where permanent pasture, our permanent fixed pastures and set times really don't quite work.
Yeah.
You get off a little easier.
That makes a lot of sense.
Anyway, that was interesting to be able to share with somebody that was challenging what we were doing. Hey, this is why we're still using some portable fencing. And as a matter of fact, we're embracing it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Race, just kind of some rapid fire questions here real quick before we head to the next break. What kind of enterprise are you running on? Pairs, year stockers? What are we running on them?
Yeah, for us, we started out running a lot of pairs,
Okay.
and doing that, and some of the, continued analysis of our operation, lighter cattle are better converters of feed.
Yeah.
And, once again, I don't say you can't run pairs on it, but they better be pretty valuable pairs.
Okay.
Maybe in a seed stock scenario or something, but these lighter stocker cattle, you can run more of them per acre and just produce a lot more cattle per acre. And consequently, it's no amazing or, real smart person to figure out their cost of gains are a whole bunch cheaper.
Yeah. Well,
And so the challenge is how do you find those cattle and source them when you need them? And so there's some antagonisms there.
yeah. We'll hit this question. If it's a long answer, feel free. We can come to it in the next break. And that is, what are you growing under the pivots? Or do you have a special seed mix that you guys have went to? What are you putting under these pivots?
I can have long and a short.
Okay.
I basically think that, we need to grow pasture, grasses, and legumes that are really well adapted for your area and where this is a little bigger audience. What works perfect for me or works well for me is not going to be the same for somebody in another state. And so we do rely pretty heavily on, some of the orchard grass mixes as well as, some brome, some meadow bromes mixed with legumes. But once again, they're different in different regions. So my short answer is if it's persistent and productive, we'll graze it.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's take another break. When we come back, I want to get into kind of the results and your advice that you would offer to folks as they potentially could be looking at this. We'll do that when we come back. Okay.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
As we continue on, my guest today is Race King, who is the manager, one of the managers of the Matador Ranch, the Selkirk division there. And we are talking here today about just transferring, maybe looking at if you're an operation that has pivots or irrigation of some sort, maybe migrating away from that and looking at grazing cattle underneath that. And Race, one of the questions that I had as we start pulling this down into some results that you guys have had and looked at over the years and advice you're going to offer to folks is you're in Western Montana, but as far as for guys in other parts of the country that could be transitioning to moving away from maybe their row croppers, corn or soybeans and things like that, you think this is viable for them?
I think it is, especially under the current markets, right? Commodities under pressure. Mm-hmm. I guess my question would be that you have to compare the opportunities you have within your ranch based on your area. Obviously, we didn't compare our scenarios to corn production, but we can't compare it to malt, barley. And so I think those are things that you have to do on your analysis. But I think it's fair to say that it could work anywhere under the right circumstances.
For sure. So let's start getting into the outcomes that you guys see? And you've touched it a little bit on it, but let's get to the results. You've been doing this for over 20 years now. And my guess is it's working. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been doing it for 20 years. But what are just overall the results and the economic element and the impacts that you feel? Because I think it's everything. I know one of the things that as I think about this, as folks are listening to this, is okay, the results, from an economic side of things, we want to know that. But they're also thinking, you were just talking about daily moves or labor, even if it's every 3-day moves. And labor's a hard thing for a lot of guys. So let's address the economics, the labor side of things, and the results that you've seen after 20 some years of doing this.
So we'll talk labor first, since you've kind of, honed in on that a little bit. Compared to our haying operations, this is much less labor. It did require some skill set. And I'll give you an example. I have one man that will rotate pastures on 20, 25 pivots. And that's pretty much his job, rotating pasture, putting out mineral as he goes or supplement to those calves, and moving a water tank, every other move, right? And he's done in the early afternoon every day. And so I look at that on 3,500 acres. That's pretty efficient.
Yeah.
To have one guy, we do helping, do moves, and we have another crew that's monitoring livestock health, around, but pretty efficient. I sure can't do that with the haying operation. It'd take more people just to run the equipment. So I look at labor. I think it can be doable if you set it up to be pretty simple. And I think that's the key. I think the focus here, and once again, it's a little bit cliche, is we're trying to get the animals to do most of the work. Mm-hmm. And if we can design our paddocks in a way that, hey, we have to roll up a little wire, but it's pretty short little stretches, right? And we talked about the design we have. And the reason that was important is so, it takes less than 5 minutes to put up a fence. On a 440 acre pivot, might have 400 yearlings working on it. Pretty simple, right? Mm-hmm. Takes about the same to take out. So you might have 10 minutes just taking down, putting up wire. And so, it leaves you a little bit extra to monitor and stuff. So pretty good. I think we justify that and would challenge that. Mm-hmm. So the labor's pretty doable. Irrigation expenses are very similar.
Yeah.
It's not really changing because we're trying to get the most production out of it. I would say maybe the things that we've really seen is that this is a long-term investment. Okay. And I don't know, you probably talked to some other people and had other programs, but if you're somebody that's going to try to make this decision, I think this has to be a long-term investment because, it's going to take some time to really get these pastures in production. And we think like in our soil types and in our area, we can graze them the first year we plant. We might have a cover crop on them, mm-hmm. But it's going to take us a few years to really build up the soil health to where these things are really, really rolling. And that might be 3 to 5 years before we're really rolling with it. But as we do that, I think one of the things that we try to express when people come out onto the ranch is that over time with the cattle being on the land, and I'm a cattle guy, mm-hmm. I think one of the real benefits to the farms is it's going to add some problems, right? Fencing, and you got to be around in the winter to take care of livestock, right? But we're bringing those livestock back and we're upcycling the nutrition. And so over time, as we build greater soil health and resiliency, we're able to utilize more of our rainfall, and the question always is, it's not how much you get, how much can you, put into your soil, right? Mm-hmm. How much of that's really usable for you. And as we incorporate the livestock, the cool thing about them is, don't quote me on this number, listeners, or you, but we hear 85% of what goes through a cow's mouth goes right back out as manure from a nutrient value. So the animal's pretty efficient, only using 15-20% of that nutrition, or at least a small portion of it, if we're not holding me to a perfect number there. The rest of that's going back out to feed your soil and, prime the pump. And do we have deficiencies that we still need to address with fertilizer or other inputs? You bet. But over time, watching soil tests, those really diminish. And so some of the big savings and production costs come as we can kind of wean ourselves away from some of the other inputs that really get to be pretty burdensome.
Yeah. It kind of maybe self-answering in a way when we keep referring you back to the fact that you've done this for 20 some years, which means you went through several cattle cycles. All right. And getting back to the economics of this. So that's kind of where this question is stemming from. Does it still pencil when we see the cattle market go down?
It does for us. We had some periods where hay was high and cattle were relatively cheap. And it still worked for us, in the areas that we really had in production. It was a little bit of a challenge. A lot of times guys want to take their least profitable pivot or piece of land and expect their poorest farm ground to end up yielding more dollars than their best farm ground, right? And it's not going to pencil this. It can still pencil, but it's hard to compare good soil to marginal soil. But I will tell you that we've really seen some big, increases in soil health, which in turn really lowers our inputs and increases production. And, one of the cool things is we've got a lot of these pivots now because we started with some of the old ones. It's literally been over 30 years on probably 2/3 of this farm, if you will, since a plows turned some of those pivots, right?
Oh, wow.
The newer ones. And so once again, that's helped us, from a cost perspective, because we did wean ourselves off of equipment pretty hard, right? We don't, we're in more of a hay area, right? But we don't have a swather. We don't have a baler. Once again, we have a neighbor that can come in and cut some hay and do some things for us. But yeah, we think it can work. And obviously years like this, it looks really good. About anything pencils with cattle right now.
Yeah.
Margins are pretty good.
Race, one more question before we get to the very final one, and that is, and this just kind of addresses a new technology that's really hitting our industry right now. We were talking about fencing a bit ago. Are you guys, or have you thrown around the mindset of a virtual fence collar on these animals that can, do some of what your portable fencing is doing?
Yeah, we, on Matador, the other division, the Beaverhead division, has been doing quite a bit with a couple companies.
Okay.
On some, mature animals and in some remote areas and a couple different applications. So they really had a lot of experience. For us here, we are still looking at it. We might put our first collar. I think we are going to put our first collars on a group of cows this summer and start utilizing them a little bit here. I think it's super exciting.
Yeah.
I think it's a game changer. It's simple. We're still going to be doing a few things. And, especially in our winter grazing, because we rotate pasture every 3 to 7 days with frozen ground in the winter to graze our cow herd, that where our cows really haven't eaten hay since 2006. And, I get thinking about how much harder it is to put a temporary fencing into frozen ground. I think our quickest application for those will be on, mature cows in the winter grazing. But having said that, there are a few challenges with stalker cattle as they're growing that fast. Probably be adjusting the collars a little more often, and then obviously pulling them as we start shipping cattle. And so we've been a little slower to adopt that, which is funny because I totally love the idea and concept, but I'm an early adopter on a lot of other technologies, but I've been slow there. And I would say it's kind of cool, and I'm excited to see what the future brings with them.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about the fact that these are growing animals. They're growing rapidly, especially, if they're 2 to 3 pounds a day type gain, those collars are going to get awful tight. I didn't even think about that. Okay. Yeah. As we kind of wrap up our conversation, I think about just any time something comes to us and it's different than what, you and I are probably both raised on very, very traditional style farm ranch growing up. So when something's new, there's hesitancy, and I think that's fine. That's nothing wrong with that. And there's concern about how much risk tolerance do we have. So for folks that would be maybe a little hesitant about this, what challenges in all of this did you consider, and kind of in hindsight and retrospect, advice that you would offer to folks that could be thinking, well, I'm not quite sure about this?
Well, I think the first one is you just need to make sure that you're bought in, and, your support team will support you. Because anytime we make some major changes, I think we have to be ready for some learning curve, right? We can't just read a book and be able to apply everything. And that's the beauty of agriculture. There's a lot more out there. Every year's different. And I think the support needs to be there. But I just think that if your situation warrants, a trial, to do it enough and do it wholeheartedly, even if you're not the one that's bought in, right? Really, and take an honest look at it, evaluate your results. But know that it's hard. It's not going to be something you can evaluate in 1 year. It's going to take multiple years. And I would maybe consider monitoring soil health as you do that, whether it's organic matter or kind of looking at some things that, can kind of help you realize that you're moving the pendulum there and understand that, hey, my soil is a little healthier. I should start be able to see better outputs here and move forward.
Yeah.
Maybe one thing I might throw out there too is, we talk about how we've lowered risk with this, right? We feel like that, right? And it's easy to say, hey, got rid of all this equipment that was depreciating, right? But the dollars are still invested. We're looking at these cattle prices.
Oh, yeah.
You think of, the investment right today might even be higher with the value of this livestock, right? And so it's going to require a little bit of risk management as well. And we know we're feel like, the next year or two looks pretty good with these markets, but at some point this thing turns around. And I think we all, to be fiscally, responsible, we have to understand that we do have some risk in this livestock market, and the investment there is real. There's a lot of dollars tied up there.
Yeah.
May not be in iron, but it's still invested.
Yeah, that's a good point as we leave out here. Well, Race, thank you. You want any comments about just the Matador Ranch and your guys' operation there real quick? I want to make sure that you kind of have time to brag on your outfit a little bit as well.
Well, and, I guess maybe the plug I'd put in, we're going to have a field day this summer, June 25th and 26th. And if you're one of those people that are kind of wondering about what do we do out here, and we're going to be able to go out on pivots and do some tours, you can go to Matador Ranch and Cattle, the website, and go ahead and sign up for our event that's going to happen. And we'd love to be able to show you around and maybe show you in person some of the crazy things we do. And once again, I think the thing that's coolest about opening the doors is having honest people share their concerns, or, hey, why does that work? Or what are you doing there? We learn a lot hosting tours just as much as we learn going on a tour. And so, I'm selfish in asking you to come because I know I'll learn from you.
You bet. Yeah.
But anyway, look at our website and get signed up and come see us this summer.
You bet. One final thing. What book's on your nightstand, or what do you listen to, or what do you do to kind of from a self-improvement, from a business standpoint?
I'm like a lot of guys. I take a lot of advice from different people, and, this might be not as much fun. I wasn't a soil guy.
Oh, really?
I was a cow guy, right?
Yeah.
Didn't really like the farming side of it. And I'll tell you the things that I've learned the most from, and I've been slow to kind of embrace soil health over my career. And one of the simple ones is Gabe Brown's Dirt to Soil. And, I think some of the fundamental soil health principles have helped me more with our livestock and our production than anything.
Yeah, very good. Race, great conversation. I appreciate you being here, and maybe someday we can do it again, and glad to have you here.
All right. Well, thank you, sir.
You bet. And again, that was Race King. He is the manager of the Selkirk division of the Matador Ranch. Now, they are located in southwestern Montana, around Dillon, in fact, to be exact on that. And Race had mentioned about their upcoming field days that will be taking place this year for the Matador Ranch. It's June 25th and 26th of this year. You can go to their website at matadorranchandcattle.com. You can find out more information, not only about the field day, but about their ranch operations as well.
Are you disappointed with weaning weight gains that don't seem to keep up with the increase in bull prices? Try capitalizing on the muscle, growth, and efficiency of Limousine and Limflex hybrids. Whether you sell calves at weaning or retain ownership through the feed yard, the extra muscling and performance of Limousine cross calves will add pounds to your pay weight and dollars to your bottom line. In fact, genetic trends for weaning weight EPDs in Limousine cattle document an increase of nearly 25 pounds over the last 10 years. Limousine and Limflex deliver dollars to your bottom line. Limousine today, profit tomorrow.
Horn flies stressing your cattle? Make fly control one and done with Alticid IGR XRB. Alticid IGR XRB delivers season-long hornfly control from a single application bolus, providing up to 195 days of relief regardless of mineral consumption or location. It breaks the hornfly life cycle with no impact on beneficial insects, giving you flexible, consistent control. Learn more at cargillanimalnutrition.com/Alticid bolus.
Back in February at the Cattle Industry Convention, I had the opportunity to sit down and visit with Wesley Moore, who's the Beef Technical Supervisor for Cargill Animal Nutrition, as we talked about fly control. So we got into that. We'll start in that conversation, but we'll also be talking about a product that's available that's not the normal ways of administering fly control to your cows. It's a little bit different method. Let's jump into that conversation now. Fly pressure is always something in the summertime that as ranchers we're having to deal deal with. There's some years it's worse than others, but at the same time, every rancher deals with some aspect of fly control. How they choose to deal with it, of course, is their choice in that. When we look at this, I think one of the things that I've been interested to know is just how much that pressure on these animals really is costly to a rancher in a way. It's kind of one of those hidden costs we don't really see until, maybe down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and we talk fly control a lot in general. The economically important fly in cow-calf operations would be the horn fly. It's a much bigger pest than most people give it credit for. So horn fly lives on the animal, essentially, goes from back to belly, depending on where the sun's at, reproduces in the manure of the cow. Each fly takes about 30 blood meals a day. And so you could start compounding that if you have heavy fly loads. As an animal's losing blood, they're losing performance, whether that's preg rate, weaning weight, milk production. Central Life has a lot of good data out there to show what the horn fly cost.
When we look at, from a lot of this standpoint with fly control and just the management of it, depending on the location where you're at, region-wise, I think there's management, whether you're in more of a northern climate versus a southern climate, there's definitely strategies to go about in managing that, isn't there?
Yeah. And most people that are fly experts will tell you it takes a comprehensive management plan for external parasites. Horn flies are typically the focus of that plan, but it goes clear from hygiene to managing the population of the fly. There's topicals, there's feed-throughs, there's lots of different options out there, but doing nothing is absolutely the most expensive option there is.
You talked about back to, when we look at geographical locations of folks, definitely folks in southern climates, because of the warm, it's more of a year-round deal versus the northern climate in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. So if you go to the southern U.S., the Gulf Coast, fly season is going to be 365 days a year. And central Missouri, where I live, we probably have about a 200 to 230 day fly season. Probably up your way, it's probably going to be 150 to 180 days, somewhere around there.
Over the years of fly control, technology has evolved, though, over the years, hasn't it, in fly management?
It absolutely has. And insecticides have evolved just like feed-throughs and other management strategies that we use. The problem is duration, right? Those cows, a lot of times, we're working once or maybe twice a year. They're through the chute. We can use a fly tag. Even the best fly tags probably give you 6, maybe 8 weeks of coverage against flies, but the fly season just lasts a lot longer than that insecticide does. So,
one of the other questions I asked you about how technology has changed is also getting to the point of this, and I want to talk a little bit about the Alticid IGR XRB, but it's a bolus format in ways that it's being used. And so explain a little bit about what that is.
Correct. So the XRB bolus is 80-gram bolus. It's one bolus per animal, 700 to 1,400 pounds. And what it does is it slowly releases S-methoprene, which is the active ingredient in Alticid, up to 195 days in the animal. So applied once and can give you up to 195 days of coverage in dosing the manure with S-methoprene, which essentially prevents reproduction of the horn fly in the manure.
So my understanding in this, when you're going to start feeding or starting to use a pass-through type product like this, from a timing standpoint, and I know if you're in a climate where 365 days a year you're needing to manage this, probably now is as good as any time. But from a standpoint of maybe folks where that window's a little tighter for fly control management, what would you recommend in terms of treating those animals with that?
Yep. So the general recommendation with Alticid is 30 days prior to the last frost, and feed 30 days following the first frost. Yep. From a reality standpoint, specifically with the bolus, we've also got to keep in mind working schedule when those cows will be going through the chute, because it doesn't necessarily justify an extra trip to the chute for most operations. So I'm going to say if you're anywhere 30 days prior to turnout, springtime type turnout, to 30 days post, that's probably when most of that bolus is going to be applied. If you have a shorter fly season, you got more flexibility. You can put it in earlier. It pays out the whole time, but it's going to cover you for the fly season.
One of the things you'd mentioned, the XRB part is extended, meaning the X standing for extended on that, and you talked about the fact that it's up to about 190 some days or so in there. As I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go back and put an ROI on this in my mind, and it's going to be based upon my other options out there. And I think that's one of the things you have to take into account with this is the fact that this is something that's going to last that long.
Yes. And it's, in a lot of ways, a niche solution, too. I mean, my suggestion to all the cow-calf operations I work with is if you have really good fly control and you're feeding Alticid through the mineral, let's keep doing that.
Yeah.
But it really fits well in those areas where, A, we can't feed mineral. 2, we maybe don't have the labor to keep mineral out all the time with Alticid. And applying that labor up front and reducing the labor spend while that cow's out on grass can be really beneficial.
Well, and that's been my experience with the feed-through fly control management is that our particular part of the country, and I know I'm not alone in it, there are certain times of years these cattle aren't hitting the mineral.
Yep.
So that's no good to put it out there if they're not consuming it. This puts that product in the animal right then and there. So I think from that standpoint, I think there's some viability there.
Yes. Yep. It's kind of peace of mind that you apply it once and, like in your country, gives you a full season of fly control.
Yeah.
Some of the hurdle is just physically putting a bolus in.
I would agree.
As an industry, we've kind of forgot how to put a bolus. I mean, there's a lot of boluses around in the 80s.
That's true.
And we went kind of injectable and drenches. It's something that I would, to remind myself, look up a couple YouTube videos on.
Don't just decide today we're going to do 200 head. Yeah.
And think safety too. I mean, anytime we're out handling the head of an animal in a chute, it works really well if you got a neck bar or neck extenders or something. But there's a hurdle to overcome is getting it properly placed in the animal behind the tongue so they don't spit it up and not cause an injury to the cowboy or the cow.
Yeah. All right, Wesley, if folks want more information, they can go to a website. It's alticidIGR.com is where they can go and find more information on that. And, of course, I'm sure they can get questions for any technical questions as well.
Yep, and it's available. A lot of animal health distributors have it. Cargill dealerships have it. So, it's out there and available. It's a good tool.
You bet. All right, well, Wesley, good to visit with you here today on the Prairie.
Yep, thanks, Justin. Nice to meet you.
And that was my conversation with Wesley Moore, Beef Technical Supervisor of Cargill Animal Nutrition. And if you'd like to find out more information about the bolus that you can administer to these cattle for fly control, again, that website is alticidIGR.com.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Today's Long Range Weather brought to you by Long Range Epronamectin with 180 days of parasite control in just one single dose. Save yourself time and money. Keep those cattle growing and healthy through this growing season. To find out more about Long Range Dewormer, you can go to their website at longrangedwormer.com. And Don, the last time we talked about the Aleutian block that was going on up there and really kind of keeping our weather pretty mild across much of the country, really dry pattern that we saw. But that has started to break up and we're starting to see some typical type spring weather.
Yeah, finally. I mean, now that the block has finally gone away, at least for now, all of a sudden, once you get that log jam broken, systems start to traverse the country. And we're seeing that. I mean, we're going to have a little bit of everything. We're going to have some severe weather. We're going to have snow in the northern tier of the U.S. and the northern Rockies. And we're going to see some really good rains across some parts of the south central United States, getting those areas some needed precipitation from East Texas up into parts of the Corn Belt. And then we're going to see the snows go across parts of the Dakotas, the northern Rockies, and Minnesota, upper Michigan, upper Wisconsin. They're going to have some Easter snow.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely areas that have been extremely dry, and we've seen that really manifest itself through the fires that has happened. Are those particular areas going to see some moisture?
Well, there's a large part of the lower 48 that's got some chances. Now, there's always winners and losers. I would say that the highest probability of precipitation is going to be biased to the northern half of the U.S. We're still not seeing storms track far enough south to really get like the southern plains and the southern Rockies wet, at least here for another week or so. But the rest of the country, as frontal systems come off the Pacific, they're going to drop Gulf moisture. They're going to get showers and thunderstorms going. So the uptick in precipitation should be good. Is it going to get everybody? No. But I like what we're seeing in terms of the weather pattern as we go into this new month, is at least showing some structural differences from what we had from November to March, which should hopefully get us back into, the joke would be, get us back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah. As you kind of look further out and you look into the springtime, anything changed or anything that you're seeing from what we had talked about maybe in our annual weather outlook for the year?
Well, the one thing that could help and hurt, depending on where you are, is we definitely are seeing the El Nino coming on. It's not there yet. We're technically not in there. But we're seeing things happening out in the Western Pacific, which indicates that it's just kind of like a coiled spring ready to kind of cut loose. And if we start to see those changes out in the Pacific develop here mid to late month into May and June, that typically, when we see that transition from the La Nina that is gone to the neutral where we are now into a developing El Nino, when that happens in May, June, and July, historically, that especially for parts of the middle of the U.S., not all of the West, but parts of the West, and especially the South, could see some recovery. But one part of the country that doesn't do well is the Pacific Northwest, and the northern plains and the northern Rockies can get dry where those areas get wet. I wish I could tell you there's one weather pattern where everybody gets what they want. It's just not possible. But I do see some relief for the central, and let's call it the west central United States as we get into the second half of April and May, if those Pacific changes continue to develop.
Okay. Is the El Nino coming on sooner than what you'd expected, or is it kind of in line with what you're thinking?
Well, actually it hasn't developed yet as maybe as some people thought it would. One way we track these things is we check the depth of the temperature of the water. And while the top of the ocean is still a little cool, still kind of La Nina-like, there's a lot of heat buildup, warmer water that's just below the surface. So we haven't seen that water reach the surface yet. Once it does, then that El Nino starts to form, and it can happen and come on fairly quickly. I think a lot of folks thought it was going to happen in mid-March, and it hasn't happened yet. But it's, like I said, it's a coiled spring. Once the wind patterns change near the equator, which we're expecting to do here mid-April, then that should get it going. So we have the warmer water, but we need a few other things to change to get it to the surface.
Okay. Well, Don, appreciate the update, and we will visit with you next week.
See you then.
And again, that was meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather. If you want to tune in each and every day to his daily video podcast, you can go to his website at dayweather.com and find the link there. Today's long-range weather brought to you by Long Range Epronamectin. Find out more at longrangedewormer.com. Well, in our little community here, my wife is the director of the preschool, and one of the things that the kids say in her classroom is caring is sharing. So if you care about somebody, how about you share this program with them, or at least share about the Working Ranch Radio Show? You can do that. Of course, if you go to a podcast site, you can share out the program, like it, leave a comment, let us know. You can also send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.